Canadian IGF Steering Committee, and I've worked in internet governance circles for about 8 years now. In the background, I'm joined by some staff from the Canadian Internet Registration Authority, who fulfill the secretariat and administrative functions on behalf of the Steering Committee of Canadian IGF. And today we're hoping this is one of our last fully remote sessions. The Canadian IGF All Hands Committee hopes to return these sessions to an in-person meeting this calendar year. We're hoping for this autumn, so we can return to an in real life version of doing things. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. I want to let you know that we're recording today's session, and we are also live broadcasting to YouTube. So you can join us there as well, and the session will be available on YouTube after the fact. The chat window should also be open for discussion and comments. Please remain respectful in your interactions, and also ensure that you have everyone selected rather than just panelists, so that you are actually talking to everyone and not just the panelists in the background. I actually need to do that myself so I can see. There we go. And you are encouraged to talk about what you are seeing today on social media using the hashtag #CIGFTalks. If you have any questions for the panelists, you can submit those in the Q&A tab, which is also located at the bottom of your Zoom window. Questions asked in the chat window rather than the Q&A section will not necessarily be seen or monitored by the panelists, so make sure you're using that Q&A tab. And there's also the opportunity to ask live questions at the end of the session of our panelists. So if you are going to be using that live question function, ensure that your mic is working correctly in order to do that. So with that housekeeping out of the way, we can dive into a bit of the business. And as you may know, the Canadian Internet Governance Forum, or CIGF, is a national initiative of the larger Global Internet Governance Forum. The Global IGF is a platform for multi-stakeholder dialogue that is convened by the United Nations Secretary General. As such, national and regional IGFs, so Canadian IGF is a national initiative, feed into a larger global dialogue about macro issues in internet governance. And at a recent meeting of our steering committee for Canadian IGF, we chatted about how there's a relatively low level of connectivity between what goes on at the global IGF and what we're bringing back from that to our Canadian IGF sessions and community. And so this session is a way to address that. We're trying to bring back some of what's being talked about at the global level and put it into a Canadian context. So yeah, in an effort to improve that state of affairs, we bring you today's session. And we're going to cover a couple of the themes that were discussed in Addis Ababa at the Global IGF meeting in November 2022. So first, we'll enjoy an introduction about what the Global IGF is and how it functions, courtesy of the Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Committee of the Global IGF, the chair of that MAG. And we are so pleased to have Paul Mitchell with us today. And then after Paul leads us in, we'll move into the discussion portion of the session with our subject matter experts. So with that, I'll introduce Paul Mitchell, chair of the IGF's Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Committee, again, also known as the MAG. Before joining the MAG, Paul spent nearly 30 years at Microsoft, holding a series of roles spanning numerous products and technologies, from Microsoft's first C++ development system, the launch of MSN, digital rights management systems for content protection, and wireless technologies. He is the co-inventor on 19 US patents related to wireless communications and led the team that developed Microsoft's TV white space trial programs, with the goal of making internet access possible for those that remain unconnected today. So Paul, I know you're Seattle-based now and have been for a good while, but perhaps I will ask you to begin by telling us briefly about your personal connection to Canada before you jump into the business of the day.
Sure. I grew up in Canada. I'm Canadian. I grew up in Vancouver and have maintained family relationships in Vancouver for all of my life. I've been actually just something just remarkable about the Canadian ethos and the internet governance is that as I go from international meeting to international meeting to international meeting, there's usually a Canadian diplomat of one type or another that is really the one go-to person in the room. And that's something that has been evident every international meeting that I'm at. There's someone from the Canadian delegation that is the one that's on top of things more than anyone else in the room, and particularly influential on matters of connectivity and service, really, with a service-oriented mindset, which is very refreshing. So, anyways, I moved down to the U.S. a long time ago, and moved back as almost to Vancouver, but not quite. And as I say, my extended family is still there. So, but I'm supposed to really not talk about me. I think I'm supposed to talk about internet governance things. And if I did this right, you should see a portion of my screen, but you should not see all of it. So,
Not seeing it yet.
am I unable to share my screen? We had it before.
Yeah. So in the background, Madam Secretariat, I don't know if you're able to deal with that. We're also trying to re-enable chat here in the background. I'm seeing that it's been disabled. There we go. Now it is initializing. There we are.
Are you seeing my screen?
We are. I think we are seeing a little bit more than, we're seeing your list of files as well as the presentation.
Okay. How's that?
Excellent.
Okay. Well, I don't know if you're like me, you're probably continuously amazed at the state of digital transformation that's happened in our lifetimes, and the WSIS being sort of a key moment. You know, our lives are completely transformed from the pre-WSIS time to now. We do everything differently. We transport ourselves, we grow our food differently, we travel differently, we entertain ourselves, we teach, we have meetings differently. The world is sort of indistinguishable, or it is vastly different to what it was at the beginning of the WSIS time frame in 2005. And while all of that's great, we still live in a world where there are deep inequities. Now we've got a term for digital specific inequities that need to be addressed, because we're moving people and systems into further and further gulfs between them. The haves get more have stuff, and the have-nots are not doing so well. It's one of the things that we've come to see now. The digital development has revealed a bunch of new challenges for the international community, and we all can agree that we want universal digital inclusion in the economy. We can agree we want everybody to have the benefits of connectivity and the internet access, et cetera, all the technologies that come along. At the same time, we've got this conundrum. We have new technology that has profound impact, but also has concentration of media, minimizing some voices, where we create worry that we are, with our emerging uses of AI technologies, that we may be creating systems that are ungovernable and uncontrollable. And these are sort of big challenges in the ecosystem of the internet. Personally, I'm a digital optimist rather than a pessimist. And I think the solution to these things, to challenges, lies in digital cooperation among all relevant stakeholders to identify and implement solutions, which is where the IGF comes in. I'm the current chair, as you've already heard. MAG, Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group, was a very unique proposition in 2005. This idea that you could assemble people together from different disciplines and have a workable model to discuss policy, to discuss regulation, to discuss challenges and technologies in a relatively unstructured management method. We've come a long way. This is the 18th year of IGF. We had over 5,000 people on site for the IGF in Addis Ababa. We had over 200 different sessions, and it was very vibrant and not what you would have expected. I want to focus on the seminal output of the WSIS back in 2005. It was this definition of internet governance in the development and application by governments, private sector, civil society in their respective roles. Those are key words of shared principles, norms, rules, decision-making procedures, and programs that shape the evolution and use of the internet. So that was concocted in 2005, and it's amazing to look at it today and realize how fit for purpose this statement still is. Because typically you don't get governments doing, and governmental processes doing things that have lots of longevity. But here we see this, that if anything, the appreciation for the multi-stakeholder model is increased with every succeeding year that goes by. So a couple of things about the IGF. It's actually more than a conference. Some people make the mistake of thinking that it's a conference, but it's actually a whole collection of bits and pieces that are assembled for different purposes as multi-stakeholder guidance. So this year we have a new component in our digital governance, internet governance field, which is the IGF leadership panel that was appointed by the Secretary General of the UN. That's an advisory group to the Secretary General that also has an input and a connection with the MAG of the IGF. And I get the seat on the IGF leadership panel, and one of the purposes of this panel is to make sure that we're getting the right kinds of inputs from different stakeholder groups that may not have been reached as well as they could have been. So this concept is that it's a platform and an ecosystem, and the component parts include things like intersessional engagements with different stakeholder groups from around the world, developing best practice forums that can iterate on particular topics. For example, cybersecurity and gender mainstreaming. There's policy networks, which are areas focused specifically on developing and analyzing policy, formulating recommendations for policy, etc. And dynamic coalitions on specific topics of interest. there's over 20, I think it's 27 at this point, issue-focused dynamic coalitions. All of those are open to anyone in the world who wants to participate. All of the main meeting does happen in a particular space, and this year it's in Kyoto in Japan in October. And while there is a physical manifestation of the IGF, since the advent of COVID, we've gone out of our way really to make the hybrid model work. And so we actually, with the upcoming IGF in Kyoto, it's a fully hybrid model, which means that there will be people on site and not on site, but integrated into a platform that, as much as possible, makes it a you are there participation experience, no matter where you actually physically are. It's guaranteed to be a certain number of people in the physical space in any given meeting room, but there'll also be the same in outside of the venue for people who cannot travel or whatnot. So anyways, there's how this thing is put together. Last year, or for this last Addis Ababa meeting, we tried very hard to come up with a way to center our thinking about themes, and recognizing that we're in a situation where there's heightened awareness across the UN ecosystem about internet governance issues. There's this process moving towards the Summit of the Future. There's our common agenda. There's the movement towards the Global Digital Compact. And we wanted to make sure that the IGF has a clear relevance in amongst all of this other work. And so the way we did that last year was to really be very careful about the themes that we were using and align our themes, especially with language, to the same language as much as possible that's being used in these other UN fora. And again, this year we did the same thing. And so we have the entire program, which is not developed yet, but the entire program will be developed on this one main theme, that is the internet we want, empowering all people. And then 8 sub-themes, which you can see on the screen here, I think. They're, to some extent, they're what you'd expect given all of the last years working, but there's some critical importance to the way the wording is chosen. Cybersecurity, cybercrime, and online safety paired up, data governance and trust paired up, digital divides and inclusion paired up, global digital governance and cooperation paired up, human rights and freedoms paired up with sustainability in the environment. And then the last one, AI and the emerging technologies and the fragmentation. So these are the 8 building blocks, or 9 building blocks, fundamental building blocks for this year's October IGF. And we're coming up on a open invitation for people to produce or make proposals for what the sessions they want to the staff to see to ensure happen. The MAG doesn't actually derive all of these things out of thin air. We do this through a process of open stock taking and participation. So, and we do that not only for the themes of the sessions that I just went through, but we also use the same kind of model for setting up the intersessional activities. So here you see on the screen best practice forums on things like multi-stakeholder networks, focus on existing and enabling good practices, cybersecurity, internet fragmentation, meaningful access. That's a key important one that came out in the IGF messages after Addis Ababa about the connectivity is not sufficient. Meaningful connectivity has a whole lot of other things attached to it to make sure that you if you're a person affected by meaningful connectivity in this way, that you will have all of the components you need to actually utilize the internet and the technologies in a facile way for whatever your needs are. So that it includes things like we need to make sure there's education incorporated, there's power incorporated, there's the collection of other parts that without you don't have useful connectivity. Other ones here, the artificial intelligence link between AI and data governance. Now, when we went to Addis this last year, there was a lot of discussion on AI. We still hadn't gotten to the big major stepping stone of having AI be attached into the search engines of Microsoft and Google, etc. And that's created a whole additional set of talking points and issues. And just to give you a sense of where you are on the world, this is the global footprint of the IGF activities. So this includes the support for regionals and all of the different activities and intercessional work that has been done. And you can see that basically we cover everybody, large parts of the planet. We're on every continent. So that is pretty interesting. The other thing that we have going is specific tracks for youth and specific tracks for parliamentarians to really try to drill into this, what it means to be part of a multi-stakeholder governance process. And if you're in parliament, what does that mean for you? If you're a youth, the next generation of users, so shall we say, what does it mean for you? How do you participate? And we are in a situation where we're about to launch a call for proposals for sessions for the coming year, for this October. We had, for this last one, over 300 sessions on different formats. We had the parliamentary track, we had open mic, we had every one of these IGFs has had some sort of focus on the national artistic settings. And so the IGF village, where in Addis we saw local cultural artifacts and classes and dances, etc., and so forth. Each country has put on their own thing, and as far as that goes, I'll stop talking now. But we'll point out that it's not too late or too early to start thinking about proposing new sessions. And you can get involved by subscribing to our newsletter. There are mailing lists that you can attach yourself to, and you can just write directly to igf@un.org if you need information or having any difficulty. but this is the way to get going. And I'm really intrigued to hear what you've got to say here in Canada.
Super. Thanks, Paul. And just a quick question. So I think the thematic call for proposals is closed now, but the sessions, the call for session proposals will be opening, and I think that usually ends up wrapping around June. Am I remembering that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So anyone can propose these things, and there are some formats that need to be followed, but it's absolutely open to anyone in the Canadian IGF community who would like to participate. Okay, so with that, we'll move on to our subject matter experts. First, I just want to express the regrets of Dr. Claire Wardle. She was meant to be joining us today, and she works and teaches at Brown University. She was set to speak about the theme of enabling safety, security, and accountability, with an emphasis on the topic of online harms. Unfortunately, she encountered a bit of a personal emergency this morning and is sending her regrets. But that leaves us with two perfectly brilliant and lovely speakers whose experience and talking points will no doubt fill that extra time. So first we have Natalie Campbell, and she will cover the theme of internet fragmentation. And we also have Elizabeth Thomas Reno, and she will talk more to the theme of advanced technologies, including AI, that was covered at the Global IGF in Addis Ababa. So I think the way we're going to do this is, Natalie, I'll have you introduce yourself first, and then talk a little bit about how you or your organization participated in this past Global IGF. And just cover your theme of fragmentation at a high level, and then Elizabeth will do the same thing with you. So Natalie, over to you.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for having me here today. It's a real honor. So my name is Natalie Campbell, and I'm Senior Director for North American Government and Regulatory Affairs at the Internet Society. I'm based in a city called Saint-Jérôme, which is just north of Montreal, Quebec. And essentially my role is to help governments improve decisions about the internet. In the last few years, one of the things I'm proudest about is I helped lead a team to create the world's first Internet Impact Assessment Toolkit, which is a framework that we now use consistently at the Internet Society to help inform how we view decisions that could impact the internet, and use that as an educational tool to help influence and improve decisions about the internet. So essentially, the Internet Society's mission is to keep the internet open, globally connected, secure, and trustworthy for everyone. And there are two ways that we go about achieving this mission. The first way is to promote the growth of the internet to everyone that wants this. And we do this primarily through support of community-driven internet connectivity solutions, which we call community networks. And this, as I mentioned, is to help make sure that the internet is available and it's fast, affordable, and reliable for everybody that wants it. But the second part of our work to achieve this mission, and something that we're increasingly leaning into, especially since last year, is our efforts to protect and defend the internet. This informed one of our major themes at the IGF last year, which was working to prevent internet fragmentation and to avoid a splinternet. What is a splinternet? So essentially for the Internet Society, the splinternet is a worst case scenario. It could take so many different forms due to fragmentation, but essentially it's the idea that the internet splinters into many different islands of connectivity controlled by governments and corporations that are no longer seamless or even talking together with ease. So this is one, we talked about different things at the IGF, but this is one of the key themes that we talked about, and I'm excited to talk more about that today with you all.
Super. Thank you, Natalie. And Elizabeth, I will pass it over to you for the same.
So thank you very much, Alicia and Sarah and Team Canada IGF for this kind invitation. I am really happy to be here with you today. Far away from Canada, but it's always with me. My name is Elizabeth Thomas Reno. I've been the head of the GPAY Secretariat since shortly after the Global Partnership on AI was launched in 2020. This is actually my last external speaking event in that capacity, as I'll be soon moving to a role taking up the launch of a new OECD activity. But it's been an extraordinary pleasure to work on this initiative. My background coming into it is ICT and digital policy, having worked for the private sector for a very long stretch, actually representing members like Microsoft and Paul and active engaged participants at the International Chamber of Commerce. When I was also at some point serving on the Internet Governance MAG, helping to plan past IGFs and engage with the stakeholders there. So when I got this invitation, I was particularly keen to try and join you, as this is a topic very that I believe very strongly in, and I think the IGF plays an incredibly important role in that. The Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence, it's an international multi-stakeholder initiative as well. It has 29 member countries that represent different geographies and perspectives around the world. Its mission is to bring governments and experts together to support and guide responsible adoption of AI grounded in shared principles that are based on the OECD AI recommendation. And these are aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda. I'll speak a little bit more maybe about the foundational role that Canada has played in that if you'd like. But for the moment, I'll just highlight a little bit about what GPAY does so that you can contextualize our participation. Members set AI-related priorities, and then multi-stakeholder experts that are nominated to GPAY bring in perspective from really wide variety of sectors and stakeholder angles. There's this effort is taking place to include the diverse perspectives of from a global point of view. One of the reasons that we participated in the IGF was because, like the IGF, I think Paul mentioned earlier some of its history and background. I think the IGF should be very proud. It's inspired other multi-stakeholder models. I know when Canada was thinking about the format of GPAY and how it would be, how it would work, there was a lot of inspiration of successful multi-stakeholder engagement. In our session, we tried to share a little bit about GPAY, introduce it. It was a first opportunity to bring GPAY to the community and help explain what other international cooperation activities were going on in the domains of AI, and perhaps identify potential future synergies as well as areas of novel interest or unique contribution. We also benefited from the fact that the current summit, your IGF host in Tokyo, is our current lead chair, Mr. Yoichi Ida. We had just finished our summit in Japan, so we weren't able to be in person in Ethiopia. But we brought our session virtually with the help of all the great teams in IGF who make that possible. During our session, one of the things that Mr. Ida tried to emphasize was the importance of inclusion and diversity. And he highlighted how from our summit just prior in Tokyo, these were thematic priorities of the GPAY Council. So these include the fight against climate change, health and life sciences, including combating the COVID-19 pandemic and preparing the world for future pandemics, the impact of AI on human rights, including gender equality and inclusiveness, factoring AI's potential to impact those with disabilities, and harnessing AI's potential to promote a resilient society. during the session, we had a fruitful exchange with participants, and we received some very pertinent questions, such as the potential risk of overlapping with other initiatives in the ecosystem, to which we pointed out that GPA's focus is very uniquely oriented towards applied projects and not policy activity. GPA, we were also asked a little bit about GPA's criteria for membership. And as I mentioned before, this is based on like-mindedness as it's framed in the OECD recommendation. So very open and interested in diverse perspectives at GPA, but really values-based and aligned very strongly with those values. And actually that recommendation is really important because it's also the basis on which any expert or participant that engages with GPA needs to align themselves with. So everyone's kind of rowing in the same direction. And we were also asked a little bit about the domestic and global priorities, the potential clash of those. GPA is an international initiative, and the really unique value, I think, of GPA is bringing experts from these diverse entities to cooperate, diverse countries and perspectives to cooperate globally. At the same time, the insights that GPA projects produce inform governments, they inform other stakeholders, and then they can enrich domestic activities as well. So I'll stop there for now.
Super, thank you. And keep the questions coming. I'm seeing them already starting to pile up in the chat there, so we will address those at the end. Thanks, everyone. But I still get to ask my questions. So first, for you guys, how does coming together at the Global IGF as a forum advance the conversation in your space? And you each touched on it just a little bit, but if you could just go into some more detail of the value of the IGF to your thematic areas, your subject matter.
Sure, I can go first. So I think it's important to raise issues like internet fragmentation to broaden greater awareness of the very, very real threats facing the internet. And the IGF is a great space for that. Most of us who have access to the internet absolutely take it for granted. And then problems like COVID come along and remind us of how this is a critical resource for work, to learn, to connect with others, to find solutions to some of life's greatest problems. But we cannot take this for granted, because if we don't start taking concerted actions to protect the internet, sooner than later, we're not going to have one at all. So venues like the Internet Governance Forum allow us, and especially the local ones, allow us to pick up on these broader issues like the ones we discuss on a global level and really examine what's happening at home. For instance, when we were at the Internet Governance last year, one of the reasons we were talking about fragmentation and, this idea of a dystopic splinternet was because we started to get super worried soon after the unfortunate invasion of Russia into the Ukraine started to trigger threats to the internet. And my condolences to anyone who's impacted by that war. It's devastating. So we started to get really concerned when we started to see government requests and actions that would have the unintended consequences of disconnecting networks and hence regular people from the internet. But fragmentation is not just a threat in this instance, it's a threat in every single country. I think a lot of people are talking about internet fragmentation in a really structural sense. So like shutdowns or countries creating walled gardens for themselves, and picture this happening in autocratic countries. But it's happening in countries around the world. And the more that governments and businesses are making decisions about the internet without taking concerted steps to protect the internet, the more that there's an onus on all of us to monitor for unintended consequences that could harm the internet. So as I mentioned, I think that the Global IGF is a great place to flag some of these broad issues and have really serious and sometimes often hard conversations about things like fragmentation and what we all need to be doing to protect the open, globally connected internet. But the opportunities of local IGF, such as this one, is to really, take that and reflect what's happening at home and how can we make sure that our actions at a national level are aligning with our commitments on the international scene.
Super. And over to you, Elizabeth.
So I'm going to be probably a bit brief on this question, just simply because we were involved in our summit and not actually able to be on the ground and participating in a large share of the exchanges. So we didn't benefit from really following the broader conversations about AI at the IGF. But I will say, just to reiterate what is really important for GPAY is, this international cooperation, bringing it, we agreed with the lead chair when we talked about the possibility of engaging with the IGF as sort of this first introduction of what GPAY is, an exploration of whether there's an interesting dialogue to pursue, that we were all very well aligned with that. I think we also wanted, as I said before, to use that opportunity of the IGF to kind of spread the word about diverse activities that are taking place in multi-stakeholder contexts that can, plug into the internet governance forum discussions. I recall when I was sitting in the MAG, we used to talk about what's the quote unquote impact of IGF and looking for ways to to qualify and quantify that. And I think, sometimes that was hard to pin down. And I do think that things like the IGF, discussions like the IGF and important cooperation like the IGF is inspiring and is propagating really useful, interesting sort of different models, but built on the same sense of values and exchange. So I think that's really, in our limited experience with that particular event, that was really where we were coming from, and I think that's what we were able to both contribute to and receive.
Super. And then kind of related to this, or to go down the path a little bit more, and Paul, maybe you can jump in on this too, is, IGF's been around for 18 years now, I suppose. How has it evolved in the time that you all have been involved there, and how have you seen conversations advance? And it doesn't necessarily have to be related to GPAY or fragmentation, but just in general. Are you able to comment on that?
Oh, I'll throw out
Go ahead.
a couple of things for thought. When the IGF was first founded in 2005, the idea of multi-stakeholder discussion was really hard to sell. It was hard to figure out what the definition was going to be, and that's what triggered the fairly convoluted but still useful definition of internet governance. And between then and now, we've had one re-up of the mandate for the IGF, right, at the 10-year mark. And it's probably best the easiest way to sort of answer your question is to reflect what happened in 2005 and what happened when the re-up was approved by the Secretary General and the rest of the UN ecosystem. And that is that over that period of time, it had grown in intensity and in volume, and the discussions were increasingly more material to daily life and work for people outside the internet governance space. Yeah. And that's sort of the measure. You look at the things that get measured, and those are the things that get done. And in the IGF, what we see has happened is that very distinct approaches to certain policy formula and policy discussions and goals have really blossomed. And they've gone from what the heck is enhanced cooperation, which was a term that was thrown out because they couldn't figure out how to say more cooperation without landing it somewhere. And we actually spent time in meeting rooms in the bottom of the basement of the ITU trying to answer the question, what is enhanced about enhanced cooperation? Why isn't it just cooperation? And we don't worry about that anymore. Today we just cooperate. Now we have more measurements. So UNESCO's got the ROMEX approach, where they've rights-based, etc., and they've got indicators that they've defined, and those get measured, and that again turns into action. Then we see, over this time horizon, we had all of the experimental wireless services, the Google balloons, and we had the glider approach, and these things have all come into being, and largely have added to the knowledge base of what we need in policy. Or broadly, it's not just policy, right? We need sort of business models, and we need policies, we need flexibility, we need regulation of one kind or another. And we're now seeing real substantive discussion of those topics not only in the IGF big meetings, the one big meeting that happens, but in the intersessional work that sort of spread it out. One of the slides was, where is the IGF, and it's everywhere, and that's sort of the answer to your question, I think.
Thank you. Natalie or Elizabeth, anything to add on how it's developed over time for you?
So I wouldn't say that I've been involved with the global IGF for quite so many years, as you mentioned, but I do think it's important to see the value in having multi-stakeholder conversations, especially when it comes to internet fragmentation. And I know that there's some great work being done by one of the policy networks on internet fragmentation at the IGF now. But I think it's important to have these conversations so that we can come to some kind of a multi-stakeholder shared understanding on what is internet fragmentation, what do we want to avoid, so that we can come away from these meetings and be able to raise awareness at a national level.
Yeah, so I can just jump in. I'll share with Paul that first IGF and where it is now is such a long journey. And really, I think the community should be incredibly proud of themselves. I mean, even when I was in the MAG, and it can't be that long ago, I'm not going to confess how long it might be, but I saw that map and all those national and regional and youth IGFs that have emerged. The IGF isn't a single actor. It's a community. It's a space of sort of inflows and outflows. I think that's really incredible. I think it's got a very it's got history and an important role, but it's also kind of evolved in a very organic and interesting and probably a bit complicated, I'm sure, Paul, managing some of those many different evolutions that exist today in the MEG and in the program is not easy, but it adds a richness. And when we talk about inclusion, it makes it easier for different people with looking for different things to find what they're interested in engaging on. So I think those are very positive. I would hope to get the chance to go to Japan for the next one, so I can tell you more after that.
Yeah, what a perfect location. Okay, so next, my next question is, What are some of the cross-jurisdictional issues that arise with respect to your theme area? And what does Canada need to watch out for in this respect?
Sure, I can go first. So the Internet Society's primary concern is that if we, and I mean all of the Internet stakeholders, don't do anything to protect the Internet from fragmentation, we're going to eventually find ourselves in a version of the Splinternet. And again, what I'm talking about here is a dystopic version of the Internet that really isn't the Internet at all. You know, it's one thing when a country decides that maybe this is the path it wants to follow, and there's limited things that we can do to prevent that. But what concerns us is that many countries have agreed that, you know, they want the Internet, and not just any Internet, they want one that is open, globally connected, secure, and trustworthy. And this is where I see some of the biggest concerns in terms of fragmentations. We say we want one thing, and yet actions can have unintended consequences of undermining those goals of the type of Internet that we all want. So for instance, one issue that is concerning us right now is the sender pays conversations that are happening in the European Union, where they're considering new telecom rules that would have services forced to contribute to telecom operators' investments in new infrastructure across the continent. So this is like one example out of so many examples that could inflict serious damage on the Internet, because it could trigger fragmentation by undermining principles of net neutrality, for instance. It really gets us away from the open Internet if we're having to pay to play. So that is one example. But another area to kind of watch for in terms of, you know, decisions that could have unintended consequences is what countries are doing to address very real and legit concerns of harms online. One of the challenges I see in how countries are approaching this is that too often they're doing so without considering how proposed legislation would have an impact on both what the Internet needs to exist in the first place and what the Internet needs to thrive. And so I know there's a discussion currently happening in Canada that there's work being done towards our own approach to online harms. And this is certainly something that we're keeping an eye on, because we would like to be available to help the government understand whether this could have an impact on what the Internet needs to exist and thrive. But the key thing here that I think governments need to keep in mind is that they must start taking a concerted decision to protect the Internet, because decisions, whether you know it or not, could impact the Internet, and you could ultimately find yourselves with something that doesn't resemble the Internet at all.
Yeah, the fragmentation theme is, you know, kind of cross-jurisdictional in and of itself. It's right there in the word itself. So thank you for that, Natalie. Elizabeth, what about you? Jurisdictional issues in AI.
So I'll just talk a little bit about one of the really important working group areas that GPA works on in this, and I know it's a priority for all of our member governments, and the pandemic was one of the examples that really bore out that concern, which is data governance. Paul alluded to it before, in data governance and AI, the link is critical. We think often of data governance issues around privacy protections. In the case of AI, that's absolutely true. The quality of data, all of those concerns. But there's also, like in the case of the pandemic and its potential response with the support of AI, the concern of missing opportunities because you have constraints on data. And so how do you balance those? And those are really, really important issues being worked on. We have a group of experts that are looking at the questions of data justice. They're looking at questions of data trust, trying to find really practical input and contributions for how data trust might be used in the case of health or climate and other really key priorities to our members. And then there's also some work going on bringing expert values to the question of privacy enhancing technologies as well, for this similar reason, to try and see if there isn't a way to get the best out of the potential of AI using systems that people can trust and feel safe with.
And are there any jurisdictions that are leading in this space that are really, forging forward government-wise, legislatively, or with regulation, that are sort of shining lights or beacons for the rest of the world, or is everyone still kind of on the same footing policy-wise?
I mean, on the GPACE side, we're not looking to get into the regulation game, right? That the OECD is looking at questions like that, and other intergovernmental actors are. In the GPACE space, what we're really trying to do is use the more sort of applied AI practical research focus to understand what are the implications of the technology, or what are the considerations that might be relevant to policymakers when they're trying to figure out either how to evaluate existing regulations or additional or evolutions in legislative frameworks. So that's really the aim.
Yeah, and so Natalie, I know Internet Society does a similar thing. You aim to provide information and toolkits for policymakers. Are you able to point to any jurisdictions that are leading on issues of prevention of fragmentation? Or
Sure. Well, I'll circle back to my mention of the threats that we were concerned about with regards to the war in Ukraine last year. So while we were seeing threats of fragmentation there in terms of both requests ICANN to remove domains, and also there were sanctions that were understandably be putting in place that were having the unintended consequences of disconnecting people from access to the internet. I would say that there was a success in terms of preventing a certain level of fragmentation there, because a number of countries, including G7 countries, including Canada, issued commitments to have sanction exemptions to make sure that companies could continue to enable internet access for regular people in Russia when they needed this lifeline and access to the free flow of information the most. So this, to me, was a huge success that was inspiring, right? But perhaps this was more of an obvious kind of threat of fragmentation that countries were being able to act on, because some of these same countries are also making decisions that could have unintended consequences that lead to fragmentation. And yes, you mentioned our Internet Impact Assessment Toolkit. So I wouldn't necessarily point to any one country that is leading in terms of preventing fragmentation, but I can say that countries that do use the Internet Impact Assessment Toolkit, similar to how you would conduct an environmental impact assessment before, proposing to put up a condo in a forest, using this toolkit does give you a leg up in terms of protecting fragmentation, because what this toolkit is it both defines what the internet needs to exist in the first place, which is a set of 5 critical properties that must be intact in order to have an internet in the first place. And then it also defines what does the internet need to not just exist, but be one that is open, globally connected, secure, and trustworthy. And it gives you this framework to analyze X decision against how it might impact what the internet needs to exist and thrive. By knowing these impacts and taking the time to analyze your proposals, you can spot like anything that impacts our critical properties. It's a red flag for fragmentation for the Internet Society. And this is a tool that we can both spot the threats and think of ways of how to mitigate them to get to the real aims of whatever proposal we're looking at in a way that doesn't hurt the internet. We are definitely working with some countries around the world, and we offer ourselves as a resource to help, whether it's civil society organizations that are monitoring decisions, or whether it's governments that, could use some help analyzing things that they're working on, which are often really tough issues. We're definitely a resource to help think through some of these issues in a way that can help countries align with their commitments to resist fragmentation.
Excellent, thanks. And now I have a more specific question for Elizabeth on GPay and Canada's involvement. It's my understanding that Canada and France were the two to sort of kick this off. So if you could just talk a little bit about, Canada's involvement there, yeah.
Sure, thank you. So yes, the GPay was actually first conceived under the G7 presidency of Canada, and then sequentially France, the two governments at really highest government level, the Prime Minister and the President, envisioned this idea of cooperation, international cooperation on AI. It took some time to build some good momentum, but in 2020 in June, they launched with 15 members and the GPay Secretariat hosted by the OECD, and then 2 centers of expertise. So one that's operating in a well-known French research institute called INRIA, and the other one is in Montreal, so not far from you, Natalie. And it's CIMIA. It's a brand new entity that was established by funds from the government of Quebec as well as federal funds. These 2 centers are the actors who support directly the working groups of GPay experts that are advancing these applied projects in AI. So Canada's investment was really important. They were the first lead share, and they hosted the first global summit, which regrettably due to COVID circumstances was only virtual, but we very much appreciated the novelty with which they brought to that organization, the organizers in Montreal. It was a hard task, and they did an amazing job. We brought together during that time the multi-stakeholder steering group, which is the way in which governments take certain orientations with the insights of experts. And Canada remains actively engaged as one of the elected government representatives on that steering committee, and continues to make significant investments in GPay, supporting its expert projects through the Montreal Centre.
Super, thank you. Yeah, I mean, our first sort of glimmers of legislation specific to AI are just coming down the pipeline in this tripartite bill that includes some privacy stuff as well. Yeah, go ahead.
Just on that note, there was a question I saw coming through, and I thought, it was about, I guess, the level of expertise of people
Yes.
making these legislations and making policy choices. And I guess what I wanted to say is in the case of GPay, I think the fact that these governments are putting in place this kind of activity, and they're recognizing that they want experts, but not just technical experts. I will say that during those negotiations on what GPay should be, there was a lot of inspiration from something like the IPCC on climate change, and should it all just be scientists? And I think Canada was a really important voice in wanting more plurality in the kind of perspectives that would be shared. So I would consider that a really positive thing, that just regardless of the individual policymakers' expertise, they're interested in having a wider angle view on the consequences and mitigating some of those unintended consequences we're very aware are there.
Yeah, totally. Okay, next I have a question for Natalie, and it's, what are the primary elements of internet fragmentation that we experience as Canadians, and what could be coming down the pipeline in other places that we need to watch out for?
Sure, that's a really good question, and something that has been on my mind a lot lately. So first, just maybe to recap, to understand fragmentation, we need to understand what makes the internet in the first place, because it isn't just the technology, it's how we use this technology. And this is what we aim to describe in our Internet Impact Assessment Toolkit. We have a white paper that sets out what are the 5 critical properties, each of which needs to be intact for an internet to exist in the first place. So that's general purpose network, an accessible infrastructure with a common protocol, a common global identifier system, decentralized management, interoperable and reusable building blocks. Our tool helps us analyze how different proposals, some of which are in Canada, could impact this foundation of what the internet needs to exist in the first place. And so one, example of a proposal that we have analyzed recently is the Online Use Act. On its face, it wasn't initially something that automatically raised a red flag for us. It's essentially a proposal that aims to have big platforms compensate news media for allowing the sharing of links to news content online. But when we started to analyze this and really go in depth in terms of how it does impact that foundation the internet needs to exist, how does it get us either closer or further from the type of internet that we want? This is where we started to spot threats of fragmentation pretty quickly. Because when you think about it, so, things like links, using URLs are part of an open internet. They're meant for everyone to use. And what the Online Use Act does is it empowers the Canadian Radio, Television, and Telecommunications Commission to be able to restrict how both individuals and businesses can use functions of the internet that are meant to be open to everyone. So how does this impact what the internet needs to exist? Well, the internet relies on decentralized management. This is a very centralized approach to controlling how Canadians and everyone in Canada and businesses can impact, could get us further from an open, globally connected internet. And to us, that's automatically, it's fragmentation, right? It's driving Canada away from the vision of the internet that we all want. And this is incredibly problematic. I don't think this was intentional. However, if we don't start to make, to do our due diligence, to start analyzing how can our decisions impact what the internet needs to exist and thrive, this is precisely what could lead us towards fragmentation. And eventually we could find ourselves in a splinternet, which I don't think is something that anyone wants.
Yes. So it's not just, Russia, Ukraine, and it's not just elsewhere in the world. There are elements of fragmentation that we're experiencing here and at home, whether purposefully or not. It's something to watch out for.
Absolutely. If I could just add on to that quickly, to speak to the other jurisdictions as well. I mean, this is one example of many, right? There, as I mentioned before, there are lots of countries considering how they're going to tackle, decisions of trying to prevent harms online, which is super valid questions that we should all be asking ourselves on how to resolve. But unfortunately, some countries are going about it in a way that would restrict, companies and services from using basic internet security technologies like encryption, which are meant to be used for everyone and are critical to that secure and trustworthy part of the internet. So, things like the UK Online Safety Act, a couple of proposals that were introduced last year in the US that would undermine this use of encryption, those are another form of fragmentation threat that we are concerned about because it drives people further away from that open, global, connected, secure, trustworthy internet.
Thank you. Okay, I think I just have one more question for Elizabeth, and then we'll move into some of the audience Q&A. And so Elizabeth, that is when the OECD principles on AI were first adopted, and then they were later endorsed by the G20, that was an effort to be ahead of the game, to get out in front of things. Things being the potential harms of AI, while still, harnessing the benefits of what it can bring us. The last few months have seen the unleashing of ChatGPT or GPT-4 on the world. It seems like I can't get through, 2 hours without hearing about something new about ChatGPT. And so what does that mean for the world, and how can GPay leverage those principles, those initial principles to help the rising skepticism or angst about these things.
So, I mean, what does it mean for the world? I'm certainly not going to have the motto to even attempt to address that question. I guess I would just want to point out that there are a lot of elements of implications of AI, that there's ongoing work already taking place. The experts that have come together and proposed different projects in GPay, for example, they align under these common values, the OECD principles. They explored rising issues, they propose new projects, and then they try to use those projects to bring insights to member government attention so that governments can benefit from that wisdom, the sound research and project skills. So among the activities that are already going on, you've got work on, with living labs and AI in workplace observatories, and all of that work is relevant actually to this question of, you have new AI systems coming into the world and everyone's panicked about its implications on education and work and other things. And those are important questions that I think these people, sort of really interesting and thoughtful people are working on together in different streams. There's other projects on, intellectual property and AI. I've mentioned the data governance and AI elements. These are very transversely relevant for diverse AI systems and opportunities. At GPay next week, we're going to have a convening of governments and experts, and they'll discuss future projects. I fully expect that language learning models will feature among those discussions. And I hope very much that the governments in those exchanges will be identifying the kind of concerns that they have, the things that they're most inquisitive about, trying to understand what and grappling with, and that experts will take away those questions and priorities and reflect on what GPay proposals should come forward and how they might deem those to be timely and helpful, and that they'll pursue them and take them forward into the ecosystem and as where I started, plug them into different dialogues as well and have those exchanges, whether it's with the Internet Governance Forum or other regional, national, and international stakeholders.
Great, thank you. So with that, I'm going to move into some of the audience questions. I think we'll start with one that we might get you engaged in, Paul. And it is a question from Graham Bunton. And he says, the internet is primarily implemented on businesses such as ISPs, hosting companies, domain registries and registrars, etc. How do we make the IGF relevant to them? How do we engage cost-conscious organizations in a forum where the business relevant outcomes are unclear or indirect? That's open to everyone, but I figured you'd have thoughts.
Well, this is a challenge for the IGF since the inception, is to get funding because it's an extra budgetary item. So it has to go dialing for dollars. That has always been the case. And I think looking at the business behavior, in the United States, business behavior is pretty consistent, which is you imagine the thing you want to do, you imagine it as perfect and being only having good spots for the most part, and you put it into the market and you try to break some barriers and do something new, and you don't worry about the downside until regulators come at you and say, you're not thinking about this social factor that you need to think about. And that's pretty consistent. All of the big internet players have played more or less by the same token. Mostly not thinking that what they're doing is bad or harmful, but having an abundance of optimism, and not being able to see the alternative view of the world. I think it is changing gradually, and as the companies get more mature. I mean, Microsoft is a much more mature, thoughtful player in the market now than it was in 1994, and I think Microsoft has learned that it pays to be a leader in trying to deal with the social side and actually be thoughtful about it from the beginning. It still remains a tough challenge, I think, for smaller enterprises, and from a business economics perspective, this is the key challenge for the internet companies. Google famously doesn't want to be evil, right? That was their moniker, and at the same time, they engineered software that was not always benign, to be polite, and in order to address it, they needed enough pressure from pressure groups to get regulators aware. Regulators are overly busy anyways, that are understaffed, and they don't necessarily understand the technologies or have the capacity to think, 5 steps ahead to figure out where the downside might be. And I think that is a gap that we have, and I can't think of any extant example where the prodding of regulators didn't occur before the change happened.
Okay. Thoughts on this from anyone else? Seeing none. I think this one we'll toss to you, Elizabeth. This question is from Hisham Kadumi, and he asks, with the advancement of corporate AI and government overreach of control to regulate the internet, and he gives the example of a bill in Canada, C11, do you think internet governance is used to destroy democracy and freedom? And how can we work to stop information autocracy to keep our freedoms intact? This could be open to anyone, really.
I don't think I have anything valuable to contribute to that question.
Okay.
All I can say is that the internet was meant to be for everyone. And, I think it is up to everyone to make sure that we protect and defend the type of internet that we want. And if we flag any things that would have adverse impacts on the internet, it is absolutely everyone's job to protect and defend the internet, because we're all stakeholders. And luckily, we have a toolkit that can help us spot some of these threats, and help educate some of the decision makers to ensure that they're fully aware of the impact of their decisions, but that can also empower, internet stakeholders to make sure that, decision makers are aligning with their commitments to protect the kind of internet that we all want.
Super. So I'm scrolling through these questions and I'm seeing a lot from the audience specific to Bill C11. I don't know that we have anyone here who can speak to the specifics of that particular bill. So apologies. I don't think we're going to cover any of these unless you have anything general to say about it. Natalie, I know that you guys do analyses of of bills as they come out, but I don't know that I've seen an analysis of C11 yet.
Yeah, I think, I mean, generally we get concerned when when we see any effort to centralize control over the internet and functions of the internet and uses of the internet that were meant to be for everyone. So I think we haven't fully analyzed C11, but I think it kind of falls into a similar bucket as C18. And it's something that we're definitely concerned about and working a lot with our Internet Society Canada chapter to fully analyze the impact of these decisions.
Great. I have a question from Marita Mole. What are the best ways that non-governmental stakeholders, especially civil society and end users, can participate in the WSIS plus 20 discussion or decisions which will take place inside the UN process? And I think that's another Paul question.
I mean, the simple answer is to actually put yourself forward and get involved. There's this mystique that you can't get involved with UN stuff, but the reality is that it's pretty easy to get involved if you really want to, because they're looking for people to help. And that's the result of being chronically underfunded for large projects. So my advice would be put your hand up and take a role.
Okay. Here's another interesting one. I don't know that anyone will be able to comment directly on it, but do you think that the TikTok ban, so I'm assuming you're addressing, Hisham is the asker, you're addressing what's going on in the US, it's just another excuse to spread public fear and sway the national public opinion to normalize the idea of controlling the internet. He says, I mean, it is allegedly based on fear of China's censorship and data collection, but it's turning every country into the same things the bill is allegedly against. So this seems to have a bit of a fragmentation angle to it. Natalie, did you want to address that at all?
I can comment on it lightly. So the thing about the proposed TikTok ban is that they haven't really proposed how to go about and do it. We've heard from TikTok that the Department of Commerce has issued a, divest, your Chinese owned shares from the company, or else face a ban. We don't know what the method of that ban is going to be. We haven't seen a specific piece of legislation or an executive order yet. What I think the question that I ask is why is the approach to addressing real national security concerns being done in kind of a whack-a-mole fashion, right? There could be, a broad federal approach to privacy legislation that might solve some of the concerns that they have with TikTok specifically, and then that could empower them to take, the associated measures to deal with those threats wherever they may come from. So some of the questions that we're mulling over now at the Internet Society, actually, but it's hard to comment specifically on how this could or could not lead to fragmentation without a specific method on how they might go about implementing this ban.
Okay. Next question is from Marilee, and she or he, I'm sorry, I don't know, asks, outside of the major Canadian internet multi-stakeholders, or internet stakeholders, I suppose, how can regular Canadians engage and participate in work to hold the government and corporations accountable for keeping the internet open, accessible, and safe, and make decisions about AI that protects citizens' data? How can Canadians help engage and participate? Any thoughts on that? Elizabeth, if you were a concerned internet end user about AI, how would you get engaged?
Well, I mean, in terms of internet governance, I would probably engage in this kind of activity that you guys are doing, or some other regional engagement. I think for GPAY specifically, we're really focusing on having the kind of expertise that's very evolved and able to contribute at that extremely sort of high level, but very well experienced level. So there is a criteria for nomination, whether it's through a member or a self-nomination. So we don't really have a vehicle for the average person in the public to engage specifically in GPAY. I think a forum like the Internet Governance Forum and its offshoots are probably much more suited to that wider discussion and a different context.
Okay. So we're coming up on 5 minutes left. I think we'll probably have time for 1 or 2 more questions. One final thing, how can we volunteer to get involved? Myself, and I believe many people here would love to know how we can be of help. So I'll jump on that. If you are interested in, helping Canadian IGF organize events or bring panels together, there is an opportunity to do that by reaching out to info@canadianigf.ca, joining one of our committees, especially since we'll be planning to do something in person this coming fall. But on the global IGF side, there are also a ton of opportunities. There's all sorts of intersessional groups that you can become involved in throughout the year, as well as, proposing sessions. That call is going to be opening up soon. Paul, any other recommendations for this question from Hisham?
I mean, it's basically, connect with somebody who's already connected and, put yourself forward. On the IGF side, we've tried to make it really easy. You can email anybody, and everything is basically
It's pretty wide open.
It's wide open. It's public. We're not trying to live behind a rock, and we like people who are thoughtful contributors.
Yeah, so definitely make an account on the IGF website if you haven't already, the global IGF one, and through there you can get in touch with other folks who share their contact information as subject matter experts, and it's a great ecosystem to get involved with there. Okay, I think with that, I'm going to close it up. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Elizabeth, best of luck in your next endeavor with the OECD. Natalie, enjoy beautiful Quebec. Paul, you're local to where I am. I know it's a beautiful day. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. So with that, please stay tuned for more information from Canadian IGF. Subscribe to our email list, which has been dropped into the chat if you haven't already. And again, if you'd like to become more engaged, email info@canadianigf.ca, and hopefully we can find some work for you to do. Thank you so much, everyone.